All right. So second part of this is to understand what's called React lifecycle methods. So React lifecycle methods are used when rendering is not enough, that you need to react, well, that's a bad word because the name of the library. You need to do something when the React component either is loaded the first time, which is called mounting, or is unloaded, which is called unmounting, it's removed, or when something updates. So you can trigger events based on these things. This is called lifecycle methods. So in order to show this, I'm just going to make a new file, my component. I'm going to call it whatever. And we're going to use class-based components first, just to show the example, because it's easier to see how these work from class-based components. So we're going to do class, my component, and class-based components extends React component. And this is a class, so similar to what you had in your JavaScript 3. And we're going to export default my component. This is the core, like this is how these always look, right? And we're going to render. So you always, this is like a base component. So we render something, let's just call it my component. I'm going to do a div, call my component, my class component, sorry. There we go. Okay, so I'm just going to import this in app. So import my component from my component. And I'm just going to put this somewhere here. I'm just going to put this at the bottom here, just for the example. So, and it's going to render now my class component here at the bottom. This is the blank component I just created. So let's look at lifecycle methods. There are a few of them that are useful. Well, all of them are useful for some things, but most of them are more useful than others. So we have the one that's called component did mount. These are built into the React library. So when the component runs the first time, when it mounts, it will run this function here. So let's try to console log. I mounted. So we say I mounted, and it will say that as soon as this component is rendered onto the page. So what is this used for? Typically, component did mount is used when you want to, for instance, fetch data. If you had a big component that needed some API data, you would fetch it in component did mount. So you would do your fetch, you would have some my URL, just like you did when you had your Ajax class, also JavaScript 3, result, sorry, there we go. And we have result, res JSON, a response, and then we have the result here, and then we can do something with the result, right? There's nothing here, obviously, because I just said my URL, so it's not real. You could do something here. You could update your state. You could do something with the data you need to do. That will typically be what you use component did mount for. It runs when the component first mounts, and you're able to do something that you need to get done when the component is active on the page. So you can put this into this lifecycle method called component did mount. Let me just remove this because it's obviously not going to work because the URL doesn't exist, but I'm just going to leave it there. So that's the first one. The second one is component did unmount. Oh, sorry, it's called component will unmount, because did unmount, then it's already gone, and that's not going to really work. So component will unmount. This will be called when the component is removed from the page. I was unmounted. So we try to render it again. It still just says I mounted because the component is still here. So it's never unmounted. So let's just try to unmount it. I'm just going to do a little trick here just so we can see that it works. I'm going to do a button similar to the other one, unmount. I'm just going to call it that. And then I'm going to do onClick. And I'm going to use state for this. I'm just going to use this as an example. It's not part of the full of the to-dos app, but I'm just going to put it here as an example. So let's just say is visible. I'm just going to make a, and I'm going to set is visible. And I'm going to use a Boolean value to determine whether or not I want to render this. So I'm going to use state again, and I'm going to set the defaults to true because I want it to be visible by default if it's true. So the way you render components conditionally, that you use your curly brackets to get into JavaScript, and then I can just use just like an if statement. So you can set is visible, can set and then I'm just going to wrap my component in this. And this is going to break now because I did not. Let me just finish this. Let's just remove this. So you will see that it still renders. It will still look the same. I have this new button here that does nothing, but it will still render the component. It will still say I mounted. And then will give me a little warning that this I don't use this set is visible, but we'll use that now. So I'll make a new function that will say unmount, and I'll make a function for that. And then I will just toggle this. Set is visible. I will update the state, and I will give the reverse value of is visible, because if it's true the first time when I click it, I want it to be false next time, and then I click it again, I want it to be true again. The way you do this in JavaScript is just negative. So it will always be the opposite of what it is now. So I will set the state as so it will be false the first time. It will reverse it every time, and then the next time I click, it will be true again. Let's see if it works. This is just an example to allow the component to unmount so you can see this event handler or this lifecycle method. So unmount. So when I click the button, it will run the function. It will set is visible to false, and then this component should go away. So let's try it. I unmount, and it says I was unmounted, and you can see the component went away. I can click it again. It will reverse it again. It will say I mounted again. Unmounted. So every time this component becomes visible or invisible is not unrendered or unmounted, it will run these lifecycle methods. Okay, so that was that one. And then we have one more called component did update. Did update. So component did update will run whenever it updates. I updated. Let's try it once. So you just say I mounted because it never updated anything. So what can cause a component to update? Either if you change the state inside the component, it will update, or if I change the props that I give to the component, it will also update. So let's try to add a prop to this. Let's just say test, and I will just check I'm actually recording. I am, and I will have some test variable. I'll just call it test. So we're gonna do another state variable just to try this out. Test, set test, and I will just call it 0. So I pass in 0, it's still not going to update because it gets this, like the initial state is 0, so the value of the test variable is going to be 0 as well. And I'm just going to pass that in. So it's never going to update, it's just going to be 0 all the time. So let me just add a new button here, just to test this. So you can see it working. Let me just say update, and I'm going to make a new function here. On update, I'm just going to set test, and I'm going to set it to the current value of test plus 1. So it's going to be 1 the first time, and then going to be 2, and so on and so on. So it's going to update every time I click this, and I'm going to use this as my onClick event on update. So every time I click the update button, it's going to update test with 1, and then we should see this updating because the prop that this is given has been updated. Try to click the update. You can see it says I updated, and it will keep saying that every time because the prop changes. I can unmount, update, and nothing happens because the component is not visible. I can mount the component again, and then I click again, and it will run update. Okay. So these are the values. This one is typically used if you want to react to something or you want to run some code when a prop updates or a state updates and you want to execute something. You will have you will have the props, the previous props, I think. Been a while since I used this. So this is called prev props. Let's just try that actually. So because it's a state class-based component, we use this props and then we have previous props. So you can see when it says I updated, it will show you the current props, which is in this, and then it will give you the previous props, the ones that it updated from. Let's try it. So you can see here, it will have the first one will be the current, test 2, and the last one, the previous props will be test 1. So you can, if you wanted to, you could have some kind of, if this props test is not equal to previous props test, so you know this prop changed, then I want to do something, like run some code. So you can listen to these changes in here, and you can run code when they change if you need to. Okay. So let's just have the same example using functional components, because I already told you we should prefer functional component. So I'm going to build the same example again using functional components. My functional component, JS, is going to import React from React. I'm going to make an arrow function this time, my component. Let's call it my functional component just for good measure. And we're going to do this. We're going to return another one called my func component. So this is just a basic functional component. So let's import it here. Import my func component. There we go. And then we're going to render that onto the page. Let's just use the same is visible just so we can see it. So we can use the exact same example. So we're going to render both of them now. I'm just going to put test in here as well. So we have all the tests set up I made. So now we have two components, right? So I still have I mounted. This is for this one. So how do we do mounted? We're going to go over this briefly. We're going to cover this even more in the next couple of weeks because this is a new topic. So just like I had set state, a use state, I have something called use effect. So use effect is also a hook, and it allows us to mimic these lifecycle methods inside functional components, because functional components does not have these. Component did update, component will unmount, there are others as well. It will not have these. So how do we run something with use effect? So use effect is written like this. It's a function. It takes two arguments. The first is a function, a callback function. Let me just say I mounted. We're just going to do the mounting example. I mounted func component. And the second argument it takes is an array. The array will allow us to listen to prop changes or variable changes. So when something changes and is defined inside this effect here, it will it will run this function that is inside here. That's a little abstract, I can tell, even just speaking to myself. We're just going to do an example with the props. I know I pass in a prop. Just console log this. It's going to spoil the fun. There we go. Sorry, comment out. So we know we're going to have these props here. I know I have one prop called test. That's the one I passed in to test the updating. Actually, we're going to start with that one because that would make it easier to understand. So we can use effect. Let's just say I updated instead. So that's fine. So it has this array here. In this array, you will define all the variables you want to listen to or observe. So when either one of these variables update, it will run the function. So if I put test in here, whenever test updates, it will run this function here. And there's a little bit of difference because you saw this mimics actually update, this component did update. And what we had here, I need to do this if this props test not equals to this props, then I know that the test run some code when test update. So now there's the only way I can check in a functional component if the test prop updated is by doing it like this. And if you have 20 of these, this is going to get messy really fast. So the way you do this in a functional component, you have the function and then you pass in an array and you just list out all the variables you want to listen to. These could be props or these could be state variables. But for this example, they're just props. So when this runs, my browser just crashed. It's back. So when this runs, when this prop is changed, it will run this function. There's a little bit of difference. You can see here that it says I updated the functional component. And it didn't say that in the class-based component when we did component update because it only runs mount. Class-based component will only run the update after it is mounted. Well, functional components, when you listen to the props, will run every time they change, and they also change when it mounts. So this will say I updated the functional component. And then we can let's just log out the value of it, just so we can see that it changes. So it says I updated the functional component 0 because test is 0 the first time. Know from before when I click the update button, I update the test variable in the state in the app here, set test. So next time I click it, it will be 1 and we will see that it will run that function again. See, I updated, which is the, let's console log this out so it's easier to see. Say I updated function component 1, 2, 3, and so on, so on. So every time that prop updates, and only that prop, it will run this function here. Only the props I have here, and that could be multiple variables you could listen to, how many you want. Typically, you would not have 20. You would maybe have, I don't know, up to anything that sounds sane, like 5 or 6 maybe. Okay, so that will run every time. So how do we do mounting? So mounting is a little different because well, it's not that different, but it's a little bit different. So when it first mounts, typically the way people do this, because you see this one also runs when it mounts. It runs the first time. It runs when it's 0. So in theory, this would also be mounting. But it also runs every time this updates. So we cannot really have our fetch API code or something in here because every time this updates, it would fetch it again. So when we do a blank array, instead of passing in variables, it will only run the first time. And it freezes again. It will only run the first time. So when I do my console log, I mount it here. It will run that the first time, but it will never update. You can see it says I mounted functional component. It will only run it first time because there's nothing defined in here. It can never run again. It can only run one time because there's no variables that it listens to. So that's mounting in a functional component. Why is this crashing constantly? Let's try to finish this. And then when I return something from useEffect, I can return another function. And in here, I will say I unmounted. And the reason for this is, we'll see that in a second just to see that it works. Let's say it says I mounted. It says here that I mounted. And when I unmount the component, it will say I unmounted. So every time this is undone, let's just try to do it here. Actually, that would be easy to understand. I can also return, every useEffect will allow you to return a function. Let's just say unmounted or changed func component. And whenever this runs, you can see every time I update now, it says changed functional component as well. So the first time it runs, it's just gonna run the function. Then when something changes, it's gonna run this callback you returned first, would allow you to clean up something. Like let's say when a test changed, I want to remove a listener to on set interval, for instance, and re-add it again. It will run this, which will allow you to clean up whatever you need to clean up, and then afterwards it will run this I updated functional component. So you see, I updated functional component. Then when I click one time, just refresh it. It says this, when I click one time, it's going to first say I changed the functional component, which is this function here, and then it's going to run the update. So these returns will allow you to react to changes before they happen, so to speak. So when I use effect with an empty array, it will only run once when it mounts. And just typically, this is how unmounting is done when it's needed. Typically, you would not have them when you listen on props. It can happen. We can talk about this more in the class. But then when it unmounts, it's going to run this cleanup function, which has been returned from the use effect when it's unmounted. So it mounts here, I mount it. When I click unmount, I unmount it. It will run this function before it unmounts. So this is how you do mounting and unmounting and updating functional components using use effect, which is a hook, which is needed for functional components. So just to compare size, this is much bigger, also has a lot of junk in here. This is easier to control once you understand it, but it's also a bit more magical. Like it's not clear what is actually happening here, which is why we use this example first to kind of understand what these lifecycle methods are. And then once you understand use effect, you can use these libraries or these lifecycle effects in a more efficient way. So that is it for this class. We'll go over this again on Sunday. I hope you have a good weekend until then. See you then.